everyone, and welcome to our video on accent, dialect and social class. In this video we'll consider the relationship between accent, dialect and social class, how we construct our social class identity through accent and dialect, how we evaluate different language varieties, why we evaluate different language varieties the way we do, and the changing landscape of language and social class. Can you remember from the early content on the module what accents and dialects are? If you can't, take a moment now to either look back on your notes from the module or look up what they mean. Now I'd like you to do a reflection about your own speech. Here it is. Pause the video here and do the reflection before moving on. So how did you get on? You may be wondering why I have asked you about your accents and dialects in a chapter about social class, or in a video about social class, because you maybe think of accent and dialect as being to do with geographical region rather than social class. However, as we began to touch on in our last video, accent and dialect do in fact relate closely to social class and social class attitudes. If you answered yes to having an accent or dialect, well done. If you answered no, you're probably now wondering why I'm favouritising other students over you. But think again. The fact is that everyone speaks with an accent and a dialect. You might be thinking, but I really don't. It's only people to the north of me, or the south of me, the east or the west of where I live, who speak with accents and dialects. I don't. If you think that way, my guess is that you live in a part of your country that is considered to have the standard accent and dialect. You probably live in an urban rather than a rural setting, and you probably live in a more prestigious part of that urban setting. It may be that there is a centre of power nearby, the seat of government of your country, for example, and there may be a media provider's headquarters nearby. If not, then you probably at least hear people that speak a lot like you on the media, particularly on news and current affairs programmes. You might wonder how I know so much about you. I don't. I'm simply applying what I know about accents and dialects to estimate your situation in terms of how you answered those questions. Some accents and dialects we call these standard accents and dialects, are more prestigious than others because they've come to be associated with power and status due to being the accents and dialects used by the most powerful in our societies and those we hear most on the media of that society. Because they have prestige, they come to be thought of as the norm, as how everyone should speak. By extension, it gets to a point where that accent or dialect is not even noticeable because it's considered the norm. That is why we hear people who have those prestigious accents and dialects claim that they don't actually have any accent or dialect at all. Accents and dialects that sound different from the norm, we call these non-standard accents and dialects, come to be thought of as other or as somehow deviant. That's why we often hear parents and other people who look out for the well-being of children and young people urging them to speak properly and correcting the sound of the children and young people's voices and their grammar. In fact, it is extremely rare that those children and young people are using sounds and grammar that do not make sense. Instead, they are using different sounds and different grammatical constructions. Different from what? Different from the most prestigious variety of the language that we have thought about above, the standard variety. Those varieties take on the position of being the standard that other varieties are compared against. So how does any of this relate to social class? Well, I mentioned that the standard varieties tend to be spoken by people in government, by people in the media, and by people who live in more prestigious parts of town. If you think about it, all of those people tend to have a middle class or even upper class background. So use of accent and dialect reflects and constructs not only regional identity, but also social class identity. If you're switched on, you've probably recognised that this discussion relates closely to the language attitudes legal case we talked about in one of our videos about ethnicity. Indeed, you'll remember that I talked about that case relating to both social class, the fact that the boys were poor, and ethnicity, the fact that they were African American. I now want to break things down a little further. We're going to explore how we pinpoint specific sounds in an accent that we seem to base these perceptions on. I'll be using quite a lot of linguistic terminology here. You don't need to know all these terms. I just want you to get the gist of the variations I'm trying to illustrate, and it's easier to use the terminology to differentiate things fully from one another. There are specific sounds that differ more for different speakers than other sounds. Sounds that identify where a person's accent is from are, in simple terms, referred to as indicators. These are things like the sound that speakers of different accents of English use for the consonant sound in the middle of water and butter. If you look up any video exploring the differences between US English and British English, it will probably pick up on this difference. Broadly speaking, and I say broadly because we must be aware that there are many accent variations in any one country, but broadly speaking, speakers of British English use either the sound T, this is known as an aspirated T consonant, as in water, butter, or they use something called a glottal stop, where the sound is actually stopped. See, for example, any recordings of East End London speakers, so wo-a, ba-a. And US speakers of English use the sound called a flap, which in everyday non-phonetic terminology would be described as something between a T and a D sound. Water, butter. One anomaly that you may already have realised as I'm narrating this video is that Northern Irish speakers of English, like me, use a sound more akin to the US pronunciation than the British English pronunciation. Water and butter is more like water and butter than it is like water and butter. Another difference between US English speakers and British English speakers is the sound used for the ends of the words water and butter, and the middle of words like quarter. While speakers from Wales and the southeast, Midlands and northeast of England have no sound for this, their pronunciation of the word ends with the pronunciation of the preceding vowel, as in water, butter. There's no R there. US speakers and those from Scotland, the southwest of England, certain pockets of the northwest of England and Northern Ireland all use something called post-vocalic R. This just means that after vowels, i.e. post-vocalic, an R sound is pronounced. So Scottish speakers would say water, butter. American American speakers would say, as we've heard before, water, butter, focus on the end of the word. And Northern Irish speakers say water, butter. You will notice that there are some sounds that speakers of different accents of English do vary. Perhaps they pronounce the sound differently depending on who they are conversing with, or in relatively more formal or informal contexts. These sounds are called markers. Broadly speaking, but not categorically, we can say that indicators are more related to regional identity, whereas markers are more related to social class identity and context, because you're more likely to vary your accent if you're aware of being judged or being perceived in a certain way because of it. I'd like you to do a reflection on this. Here it is. Sometimes the boundary between indicators and markers is blurred. Let's go back to the T sound in the middle of butter. For some Northern Irish English speakers, like me, this is a marker rather than an indicator. So, if it was an indicator for a speaker, they would always say water or butter every time they pronounced the words. If it's an indicator, they do not always pronounce it water or butter. They sometimes pronounce it differently. So, almost always, I will use that flap sound, water, butter. However, if I am in a formal situation or mirroring a speaker with a more middle class variety of Northern Irish English than the relatively more working class variety that I speak, I will shift and use the aspirated T sound, water, butter. And you may have even noticed me doing that with some words on this video because I'm speaking in a relatively more formal way on this video. You might wonder why I would want to do this when US English speakers use the flap sound, water, butter, and some US English varieties are the most powerful varieties of English that there is in terms of prestige. Think about my immediate context though. For me, as a UK citizen, the centre of power that has been communicated to me on the UK media is London. So perhaps, even as a linguist who celebrates every variety of every language, perhaps I gravitate towards that as somehow representing the centre and the power. And let's go back to postvocalic R. In the UK setting, not having postvocalic R, i.e. not pronouncing the R at the end of words, is the prestigious pronunciation. So, middle-class London speakers will say water, butter. They don't pronounce the R, and that's prestigious because they have the standard version of the language. In the US, having postvocalic R, i.e. pronouncing the R at the end of words, is the prestigious variety. Go figure. Let's think about the pronunciation of New York by native New Yorkers. Now, the R in this case is before the end of the word, but the same rule applies because it's after the vowel. So even if you are not yourself a New Yorker, you're not, and you have never had the opportunity to listen to New Yorkers speak in real life, so many television shows and movies are set there that you have probably noticed the difference I'm about to outline. Some New York speakers use postvocalic R in their pronunciation of New York, and some do not. New York. Using it, New York, signifies middle class, and not using it, New York, signifies working class. And this leads to accent stereotyping. Accent stereotyping works in a similar way to appearance stereotyping. In appearance stereotyping, young people, for example, can be stereotyped as antisocial if they wear hoodies or have piercings. The hoodie or the piercing is thus highlighted much more than, say, a t-shirt or a pair of jeans they're wearing or makeup they've put on. As there are a whole range of items of clothing and adornments involved in how we present ourselves on any given day, there are a whole range of sounds involved in our accents. Yet, just like the hoodie or the piercing, listeners may give more weight to one of the sounds we make, one of the markers of our accent, than the others, and base their perception of us on that. This is how accent stereotyping works. In the same way, New Yorkers who don't use post-vocalic R, so who pronounce New York, New York, are stereotyped as working class or even gangster. This is very likely to be linked to the fact that there are a huge number of examples of the use of this pronunciation in the gangster movie genre. It is worth remembering, though, that a gangster-related stereotype does not necessarily mean a negative stereotype. For some listeners or viewers, it will be, but some will associate it with the coolness and bravado of the gangster rather than the negative activities the gangster might do. Which brings me on to a reflection I want you to do. Here it is. It is possible, and increasingly common, for non-standard varieties to hold prestige as well. It depends on the context, and it has shifted over time. More traditionally, say 50 years ago, it was common for people to value themselves in a lower way if they spoke with an accent and/or a dialect associated with a working class identity. However, there's been a major shift over the last few decades, particularly in the context of arts and culture, that says we should embrace every variety, every dialect and every accent. And we should use our local varieties and working class varieties as well in our literature, our art and our music. If we consider popular music over the 20th century, with a few notable exceptions, almost every artist or band used to sing in a US accent. Many still do, possibly because US accents still predominate in global media today, and so when performing, that is what people aspire to, if even subconsciously. It's a fascinating phenomenon. However, more recently we hear many artists and bands singing proudly and proactively in their local accent. A favourite of mine is the band Las Vegas, who sing in their native Glasgow accent about specifically Glaswegian identities and experiences. This could be viewed as a relatively straightforward challenge of the former lack of prestige attached to that accent, a reclaiming of it, if you like. There is a more complex phenomenon involved when we think about the singer Lily Allen. She comes from an affluent background. Her father was also a famous musician, yet she sings in a working class London accent and sometimes in a non-standard London dialect. So what we see is someone who is upper middle class choosing to construct herself as working class. This suggests that, in the music context at least, working class varieties hold some kind of value even for those who do not speak them natively, if you like. People use working class accents and dialects to construct themselves as more cool or more street. The socio-linguistic term, that's just a word that means study of the relationship between language and society, which is what we are doing. So the sociolinguistic term for people using non-standard accents and dialects to construct themselves positively as cool or street is covert prestige. It can be contrasted with overt prestige, which describes the traditional approach to language and prestige, whereby the higher class variety is the variety people aspire to speak in order to gain prestige. Whilst the shift to value both can certainly be viewed as positive, we could argue that the terms that are used continue to construct one as more valuable than the other. Overt is a more positive word, connotation-wise, than covert. Still, there is a sense in which covert prestige relates to the countercultures in society and to challenges to the mainstream about what should be valued. So the word covert is fitting in that regard. If you're very switched on, you've maybe picked up that we've come full circle. The nuanced value around overt and covert prestige relates closely to Bourdieu's point that different types of capital, including different types of linguistic capital, are valued more in different communities and contexts. Well, that's it for this week's videos. Here are the key concepts from this week, divided into those I think are key and those I think are additional things that it's nice to know, but that you don't have to know. I hope you've enjoyed exploring language, media and social class with me. Bye for now.